I'm Mira Wasserman, the director of the Center for Jewish Ethics at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And in a moment, I will have the pleasure of introducing today's lecturer. First, I wanted to say just a few brief words for those who are joining us for the first time. This lecture series comes from a partnership between the Center for Jewish Ethics and the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. We are grateful for a grant from the Campaign for Community from Penn's Office of the Provost and for support from the SNF Paideia program at Penn. I want to thank Professor Steve Weitzman, director of the Katz Center, for his vision, work, and partnership, and also to thank the staff members at the Katz Center who have worked on this series. Behind the scenes are Diana Dennis-Walters, Brian Lipscomb, and Becky Friedman. And at the end of today's lecture, you will meet the Katz Center's Director of Public Programs, Dr. Ann Albert, who will be joining Steve Weitzman so that they can together moderate the Q&A. This lecture series on Jews, race, and religion is based on two related ideas. The first is that race and religion are deeply intertwined concepts and phenomena, that you can't really understand one without taking the other into account. The second is that Jewish identity and experience offer a helpful way into the study of race and religion, precisely because neither category seems quite adequate when describing Jewishness. For the past 2 weeks, we have approached the interrelation between race and religion by examining two different foundational texts, first looking at the Talmud, and then last week exploring Alex Haley's Roots as an American scripture, a story that integrated Black Americans into an American story of rootedness and hope. Today, we will begin investigating religion and whiteness. I'm honored to introduce our speaker. J. Kameron Carter is professor of religious studies at Indiana University in Bloomington, where he has additional appointments in the English and African American and African diaspora studies departments. In his work, he focuses on questions of Blackness, empire, and ecology as matters of political theology and the sacred. Professor Carter is author of Race, a Theological Account, and of the forthcoming book, The Religion of Whiteness, an Apocalyptic Lyric. He is also now editing a special volume for the Journal of American Religion on the late scholar Charles Long, who was so important in initiating the study of Black religion, and that volume will be called The Matter of Black Religion. Professor Carter's lecture today is entitled Jews and the Religion of Whiteness. And after he speaks to us, he will have time to address some of our questions. So we invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to submit your functions. And after the lecture, Anne and Steve will moderate your questions and try to get to as many of them as we can. We also wanted to let you know that a videotape of today's lecture will be posted on the Katz Center YouTube channel tomorrow, and so you can check the chat for a link to that. Welcome, Professor Carter. We're so glad that you're with us.
I want to express my gratitude and appreciation for the invitation to come and to present some of the things I've been thinking about as they bear upon the topic that is being addressed through the Katz Center this semester. I'm particularly grateful and thankful for Professor Weitzman inviting me to contribute to this conversation. So without further ado, I want to jump into this. I have a timer here. I'm going to time myself so I can keep this in the 30 to 35 minute range. Even if that means I have to like scoot past some things a little fast, we can pick it up in the Q&A. Everything I want to say today, in some respects, revolves around and can be thought through the three kind of quotations I'm going to give in the beginning. Think of these as like kind of epigraphs to what I want to say. The first one is from the German theologian and ethicist Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The second is from W.E.B. Du Bois. And the third is from the literary scholar Saidiya Hartman. And so let me begin with the first one, Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer says in a document called Ethics as Formation, which I'll be talking quite a bit about as we get into this, he says, it remains true that no other form can appear alongside the form of Jesus Christ. For only he, Jesus Christ, is the one who overcomes and reconciles the world. Only this form can help. And then I go to Du Bois. This is a quotation from out of The Souls of Black Folk. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea. And then finally, the third quotation that makes up this epigraph is from Saidiya Hartman. Saidiya Hartman says this in an interview conversation between Hartman and Frank Wilderson. She says this: I think that, responding to Frank, I think that gets at one of the fundamental ethical questions, problems, crises for the West, namely the status of difference and the status of the other. It's as though in order to come to any recognition of common humanity, the other must be assimilated, meaning in this case, utterly displaced and effaced. So those are my two quotes. I sort of want to give a reading of Bonhoeffer and perhaps more broadly this conversation, Jews and the Religion of Whiteness, as unfolding between Du Bois on one side and Saidiya Hartman on the other. So with that said, let me get going here. The all too brief comments ventured here and composed under the title Jews and the Religion of Whiteness are, as it were, poached from a chapter within a forthcoming book project of mine. That project is called The Religion of Whiteness, an Apocalyptic Lyric. The main title of this project, and that I have made part of the title of this talk, namely The Religion of Whiteness, I borrow from W.E.B. Du Bois, his essay entitled The Souls of White Folk, a piece of writing that appeared first in 1910, I believe it was, but then underwent significant revision and expansion to eventually become the second chapter in his second book of essays, Dark Water: Voices from Within the Veil. This understudied companion text to Du Bois's first collection of essays, that first collection being The Souls of Black Folk, and from which I quoted earlier, I suppose makes Dark Water Souls' understudy. I'm taken by and want to punctuate what Harvard historian Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham says about Dark Water. Higginbotham says Dark Water can be thought of as Souls' militant complement. And if this is true, Dark Water as a whole, it's surely true of the second chapter of that document, The Souls of White Folk. Perhaps more than any other of the writings of that Du Bois gathered in Dark Water, it is the souls of white folk that most militantly shadows the souls of Black folk. An assessment of the horrific events that consumed the attention of the second decade of the 20th century, those events being, just to name a few, the Great War of 1914, wherein the Western nations arrayed themselves against each other. Also, a global pandemic called then the Spanish flu, which left close to 750,000, 750,000 people dead in its wake. Another happening in that second decade, an exponential leap in extrajudicial violence suffered by Black people in the form of lynching. To name but a few of the crises of that decade, Du Bois explains all of these events, what stitches and holds them together in his arresting essay, The Souls of Black Folk, as the convulsions or the seizures internal to whiteness as such. The internal or intramural seizures within whiteness as such, with his eyes specifically on the Great War of 1914 and its relationship to racism at home in the United States. Du Bois names the root cause of the conflagration to be competition between the nations that have been designated as white nations in their pursuit of the goods and natural resources of the non-white world, as well as, along with that, a competition between those white nations to control labor. That is to say, the people who were to extract and transform those very goods into commodities. As he puts it at one point in Souls of White Folk, Du Bois says, the hatred and despising of human beings from whom Europe wishes to extort her luxuries has led to such jealousy and bickering between European nations that they have fallen afoul of each other and have fought like crazed beasts. Such is the fruit of human hatred. I have to say parenthetically off the page, that description as I reread it just put me in mind of the events of January the 6th, the kind of crazed, almost bestial-like violence and rioting which was a kind of white supremacist rioting at the nation's capital. But I slightly digress. Getting back to what I've written here. Du Bois does not exclude the US from this kind of mania of white world violent conquest. From the internal domination of its Black populations to its program of manifest destiny during the 19th century, to its occupation of Haiti in 1915, along with the other things that I mentioned earlier. America, and this is to quote Du Bois, America for 2 or more centuries has marched proudly in the vanguard of human hatred, end quote. What does one see in this mayhem of the white world? Du Bois's answer is quite telling. The mayhem, he says, is religious, inasmuch as the war manifests the utter failure of white religion. That last phrase is a quote from Du Bois. A further quote, he says, a nation's religion is its life, and as such, white Christianity is a miserable failure, end quote. Indeed, Du Bois represents or represents in this text the Great War, as the latest dramaturgical scene within what he calls, and this is to quote him, the religion of whiteness on the shores of our times. Explaining the creed of this religion, and in doing so, possibly alluding to a messianic passage from the second Isaiah, namely Isaiah 53:2, for he shall grow up before him as a tender plant and as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form or comeliness, and when he has no form or comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. I'm suggesting there's an echo of that in what I'm just getting ready to quote now. Du Bois asked the following question: but what on earth is whiteness that one should desire it? He responds to his own rhetorical question. Then always, somehow, some way, silently, but clearly, I am given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen. End quote. On what basis does Du Bois make this claim as part of his explanation to say something about the souls of white folk? He does so, or he makes this claim by saying that he's uniquely clairvoyant about the white race. Of the, and this is a quote again, of the many souls that toss and whirl and pass as he sits high in the tower above the loud complaining of the human sea. He continues, of the souls of white folks, I am singularly clairvoyant. He continues, I see in and through them. I view them from unusual vantage, from unusual points of vantage. Not as a foreigner do I come, for I am native, not foreign, bone of their thought, flesh of their language. Excuse me one second here. Flesh of their language. I see these souls undressed, and from the back and the side, I see the workings of their entrails. Du Bois goes on to say, I know their thoughts, and they know that I know. This knowledge makes them now embarrassed, now furious, end quote. Playing on the Genesis stories of the creation of human beings, Du Bois declares himself to be bone of their thought, flesh of their language, and thus reveals the basis of his clairvoyance. He, for this reason, can diagnose the pathology plaguing not just white folk, but what animates the white race, as he puts it, their quote unquote soul. This soul of white folk, the cosmology of power that generates and marks this soul, is what he is looking at. As Negro, Du Bois declares himself a byproduct, one might even think perhaps refuse of white soul, of white soul, of the pathology of the white soul. Pathos of this pathology, Du Bois understands himself as having unique insight into this soul of white folk, from which in part and only in part he's been created, given the racial frame imposed upon him, indeed upon the earth. In fact, Du Bois turns to another scriptural image to articulate further his clairvoyant capacities. Like Moses, who ascended Mount Sinai to receive a new law, and who in that ascension gained not a frontal or even facial glimpse of God, but from the unusual points of vantage, glimpses God's back and side, a divinely unveiled sexuality perhaps. So too, Du Bois claims to see white folk from the unusual point of vantage that is whiteness. What makes this unusual is that whiteness refers not first to the optical regime of skin color, rather to supplement Du Bois's language with that of the Brazilian writer Moto Mabasa. Whiteness indexes, and here's the quote from Mabasa, indexes a particularly privileged inscription in the history of power and a form of presence in the world, end quote. In short, it is the mythologeme or the mythic core of a controlling ontology, that's Mabasa's term, that organizes our racial fantasy of the real, the violence of civic humanism itself. Du Bois not only glimpses this, but dares to infiltrate this dream and upset its balance. As seer or clairvoyant, he declares that at the heart of personal whiteness, as he puts it, is nothing less than the problem of property and the racial politics thereof. That is to say, whiteness as the will to rule the earth. Moreover, this will toward world rule finds its authority in a fundamental and problematic mythical act. In a Promethean gesture, white folk who claim divinity, here the Prometheus myth, in taking the divine fires, assign righteousness, we might tweak this poetically and call it whiteousness, to themselves at the same time that they assign unrighteousness and evil to the wretched of the earth. In two compressed sentences that invoke both the imagery of lynching and classical Greek mythology, Du Bois says, to quote him, "Back beyond the world and swept by these wild white faces of the awful dead, why will this soul of white folk, this modern Prometheus, hang bound by his own binding, tethered by a fable of the past? I hear his mighty cry reverberating through the world. That cry is, I am white. Well and good, O Prometheus, divine thief." Okay, get over. I've spent these opening moments orienting you, as I've written here, gracious reader, gracious listener, to this project, for I want to bring this framework into the context of the investigations being undertaken this semester at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. That is to say, in what follows, I am interested in how Jews figure in terms of or in relationship to the white Prometheanism that, following Du Bois, I outlined above, how they figure in relationship to the religion of whiteness that I've talked about above, or how they figure in relationship to that understanding of whiteness that I've laid out above, precisely as a planetary structure of governance driven by a Christian liberal Westernist humanism that has, in quotes now, man, capital M, or we might even say Western man, at its apex. My question is, how does a certain imagination of the Jews figure within or in relationship to that Western civilizing humanism that organizes the planet? What's the relationship between Jews and the religion of whiteness? In asking these questions or pursuing this topic, I hope to instigate conversation, or better put, instigate study around Judaic studies and critical race studies, perhaps most especially Black critical theory. More still, I hope to instigate or otherwise provoke such research or investigation with questions of religion being central to such investigation. My approach today, my approach into this today is by way of considering the Christian theologian and ethicist Dietrich Bonhoeffer and what he did to try to address Aryan whiteness in its fascist mode in the 1930s and into the 1940s. This was the time, 1939, when World War II was just getting underway. Because of his elite positioning, or the elite positioning of Bonhoeffer's family, I should say, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was able to secure a civil servant job in the upper echelons or reaches of the German government. From that perch, he used his position to, in effect, carry out espionage, to pass off crucial, sensitive governmental and military strategy and information to the Western powers through contacts that he had in Britain, England. In the end, he was caught. And for those of us who have some familiarity with Christian theology or Christian religious history, we know that Bonhoeffer was executed precisely because of his espionage work. But what's interesting and what allows me to sort of go forward with this project is that while Bonhoeffer was working by day and carrying out this reconnaissance and espionage work from inside of the German government, he was at night writing and reflecting, critically writing an account of a kind of Christian theological and ethical imagination that could exist on the other side of the war. That material became posthumously collected in a book that is now titled simply Ethics. It is this work that I want to speak to. My claim before you today is relatively simple, even though it's I have a number of twists and turns by which I execute it. My claim today is relatively simple. Bonhoeffer's Christologically robust vision for a post-fascist, post-World War II world, or what he sees as a concrete ethics for a new kind of Western world, I'm arguing today, against the tide of much Bonhoeffer scholarship, does not work. Indeed, the rise of right-wing populism, both in the US and around the world, in fact, can work precisely with the kind of world that Bonhoeffer envisaged of a more embracing and ethical humanism. I'm going to argue, I contend, that this is because Bonhoeffer's vision of the human reproduces the fundamental architecture of whiteness, understood as both a political economy of power and a structure of desire and belief to which he'd been apprenticed. That whiteness is more than a personal failing. It structures the imagination and shows up in his work, in his vision, even as that vision aimed consciously and Christianly to address fascism directly. Neither Bonhoeffer's defense of the Jewish people, nor his Harlem sojourn into Black church life, nor finally his reviving of a classically creedal Christology embedded now in early 20th century dialectical theology were sufficient, and I use this word intentionally, vaccines against whiteness's capacities to adapt to and mutate within his thinking. Rather, whiteness worked with and through his efforts to release theology from fascism. My concern is with how this worked in Bonhoeffer's case, given that in his case, and given his effort to release Christianity and thus ethics from right-wing populism in his day, remains so close to us. Now, let me be as clear as I can about what this argument is and is not. More than simply a critique or a takedown, some might say a shakedown of Bonhoeffer, I'm most interested here in what haunts Bonhoeffer himself, and thus in what's bigger than Bonhoeffer, but that with a careful look at Bonhoeffer, perhaps of his serious, precisely of his serious commitment to being Christian and to advancing a Christian mode of thinking, how notwithstanding all of that, we still see the breakdown. And in fact, it's his commitment to all of that that helps bring the issues, I think, sharply into focus. To be a bit more direct, I'm interested in Bonhoeffer as symptomatic in the domain of theology and ethics of what Black feminist theorist Denise Ferreira da Silva has called the global idea of race. What I want to do somewhat before us today, and I can already see, given my time, I'm going to be summarizing a lot of moves I make here. What I want to do somewhat today is to explain, get some insight into this theologically inflected racial colonial dynamic of white subjectivity in which Bonhoeffer says specifically that intellectual practice called theology and ethics more broadly, and that the West at the most general level are still caught within. Even as I gesture by the end of this talk to, perhaps we might call it an alternative, that is to say, a thinking of Blackness, to it as a kind of mysticism and ecstatic practice, a kind of dark radiance referencing a power that is illiberal, unknown, a mode of non-knowledge that is not committed to the reproduction of liberal humanist statist logics. Okay, let me pause there. That's where we're going with this. I'm going to summarize quite a bit here because I can already see that I'm pushing my time. Give me 1 second here. I'm refreshing my little drink here. Before I move into the details, there's one more thing I want to say that I neglected to drop in here, and it's very important. What I'm going to be arguing here, and what I want you to listen for here, is how Bonhoeffer's commitment to uncouple the Western world, and specifically to uncouple his homeland, Germany, from Nazism, and in that uncoupling, move the West towards an embracing of the Jews, right? To move away from anti-Semitic violence. That very gesture gets carried out by Bonhoeffer by enacting a new kind of supersessionism. If his critique of Nazism in the West is that its supersessionism with respect to the Jews culminates in Nazism, then what I also want to show here is that his response to this, that is to reanimate a kind of Western bloc of nations, Western bloc of nations, reproduces or produces a new kind of supersessionism. The Jews now undergo a supersessionism of incorporation into the Western humanist project. Rather than seeing the Jews as external from the Western humanist project, and therefore having that externality culminate in practices of Nazi elimination, what Bonhoeffer does is to expand the confines of Western liberal humanism by reclaiming a certain Christian humanism that incorporates the Jew into Western humanism. The problem with that move, however, is that it now aligns Jewishness with whiteness. And it aligns Jewishness with a certain kind of colonialist practice that is consonant with the West. Now, I don't have time to develop here, but I'll go ahead and not hide my cards. It's that fundamental move on Bonhoeffer's part that I contend sets up the nation state of Israel in the Middle East as a Western outpost, enacting a new kind of colonialism there, specifically a settler colonialism with respect to the Palestinians. Okay, full stop, take a breath. That's where we're going. And again, I'm telling you now, I'm gonna be summarizing some stuff. I don't have time to get through all of it, but I hope that I give enough of the broad strokes that will give us space for conversation, and I can maybe address things further. Okay, let's jump in a little bit here. All right. I would now like to turn to Bonhoeffer's important work, Ethics. Seen through to publication by Bonhoeffer's longtime friend Eberhard Bethge, Ethics is the book Bonhoeffer worked on while working in the German government, but covertly as part of a resistance movement intent on bringing down Adolf Hitler and the government of German National Socialism. In effect, Bonhoeffer was working quietly in the interest of a coup. But what captivates me about Ethics as a text, indeed as a kind of case study of Christian theological thinking, is that what motivates Bonhoeffer to write it in snatches of time on train station platforms and in late night sessions is the future itself, the future he's trying to reach for itself. Ethics emanates from and pines for a new future for the human. Earlier, I said that it provides a roadmap for a future in the aftermath of World War II. But the stakes are way deeper than providing a roadmap, if by that is meant any kind of ethical theory or program, as Bonhoeffer himself puts it, just to quote him, that can guarantee or secure the future against tyranny. In this sense, ethics, if I can speak colloquially for a moment, ethics ain't about a plan. And nor, for that matter, is Bonhoeffer's insistence that ethical theories or programs can't save us, and we shall need to come back to the nature of this us, save us, in due course, due to any ethical indifference in our times. To the contrary, Bonhoeffer tells that coming up with some new magic bullet ethical theory or program that can bring down tyranny and ensure that tyranny will not come back is because the tyranny that he and his contemporaries were up against, he tells us, poses the kind of specific or concrete problems that we, again, we're going to have to investigate this, that we have never had before in the history of the West, quote unquote. Addressing the tyranny confronting the West requires a more, this is his word, radical diagnosis. I don't mean radical in the sense of a particular political stance. That's not what Bonhoeffer's after. Bonhoeffer's radicalism is meant to be diagnostic. He wants to get down to the root, radical as root, get down to the root of the crisis of the World War that is beginning. Bonhoeffer's diagnosis is that the West has become apostate. He sees the West as having veered, or to quote him, fallen away from its roots, having gone into what he calls, quote unquote, the dark night, or into what he also colorfully calls, quote unquote, the demonic abyss. That is, into the void of a possible non-existence, a non-being, a negative or abyssal Abgrund. The fascist tyranny to which the West has succumbed, Bonhoeffer argues, is theological in character, and therefore has to be addressed on theological terms, Bonhoeffer argues. On Bonhoeffer's reading, fascism is a lapsarian condition, a condition of the fall. And that fall is a condition Bonhoeffer sees as a condition of Western nihilism. Having lost its theological way, the West, as Bonhoeffer sees it, is now of the fall, or as he puts it, in free fall. This is what the war signifies, Bonhoeffer contends. So serious is this falling away that no ethical theory or program, be it Kantian, Hegelian, pragmatist, or what have you, can parachute the West to safety. Only a restored theological vision, one that takes us back to the West's root conditions, Bonhoeffer contends, can save us. It was the work of thinking through such a vision that motivated Bonhoeffer's frenzied writing of material now collected in the book titled Ethics. More still, it is precisely such a theological vision as bound up with the deep roots of the West that motivated his clandestine activities in what is called the Abwehr. His involvement with a group of friends, including even a relative, to work against Hitler by aiding the Allied forces against the Hitler-led German government. At stake regarding those deep roots was for Bonhoeffer nothing less than a love for humanity writ large, and that was under attack in the tyranny of fascism. So Bonhoeffer sees fascism in its German form as really targeting the vision of the human that should properly animate the West. Okay, to continue. Thus, the task Bonhoeffer undertakes in ethics is to tell the story of lost roots, the story of this falling away, and in so doing, reclaim those roots so as to reestablish a certain stability, a certain coherence, and in this way, save the West by focusing attention back on a theological understanding of the very meaning of the human. That is, on a political, theological understanding of the human, not limited by national boundaries. Let me say that one more time. A theological vision of the human that is a political vision of the human, a political theology of the human that is not bound by national boundaries. That's what Bonhoeffer we're going to see is going after the national boundaries part. Let me continue. The articulation, and in this way, the reclamation of such a vision as the fundamental expression of ethics offers, as Bonhoeffer sees it, more than what any narrowly ethical theory or program or project thinks it can guarantee against tyranny, against right wing, and Bonhoeffer will include as well left wing populisms, or simply put, against fascism. Focusing especially on ethics' second chapter, the second chapter of that book, titled Ethics as Formation, I would like to follow Bonhoeffer's elaboration of a theological vision and ultimately then a theological ethics that he thinks cuts fascism off at the pass. All right. My intention is not simply to recount what Bonhoeffer says. Rather, it's to expose how his vision fails precisely because of how whiteness generally and white supremacy specifically, though in Bonhoeffer's case, his version of whiteness is of the benevolent sort, how this animates his theological vision. Now, from the outside, I want to note a possible objection to this approach as to reading Bonhoeffer. I won't go into the objection. Let me keep moving because I want to at least get to the core of it. More to the point, I just skipped a little bit, so I'm picking up. But more to the point of Bonhoeffer's ethics, the reading I propose here of this important text, a text produced in the heat of German fascism, in the heat of the Second World War, etc., is that ethics is driven by a surrogate category for whiteness. Bonhoeffer doesn't use the word whiteness. He's got a surrogate category, namely the category of the human. The category of the human in Western life and thought is whiteness. Bonhoeffer's Christologically grounded vision of the human, as elaborated in Ethics as Formation, that is to say, the theological anthropology that he articulates, is, and here I borrow from Sylvia Wynter, it's overdetermined. The anthropos in theological anthropology, which is also the anthropos in political anthropology, is the figure, or in Bonhoeffer's language, we would say, is the form or the gestalt of man, capital M, where man here must be understood as Western man. But what makes this all the more interesting, if not also somewhat tricky for those reckoning with this in terms of Christian theology as a discourse, is that Bonhoeffer's restoration of an expansive and would-be benevolent vision of the human, and indeed his vision of the human as itself a particular kind of we, and thus as a statement of community, it aims ultimately to express the identity of Jesus Christ. It is an expression of a robust two natures Christology that aims to take seriously the very man side of very God, very man, in the confessional or creedal language of Nicaea, etc. Bonhoeffer deems this language important, not merely for confession's sake, but because, as he sees it, internal to Christian confession around the person and the work of Jesus Christ is an ethics of reconciliation, which is to say, an ethics not predicated upon division or separation as the basis of the world's reality or of what is real. Rather, what is real in the world and about the world is that which is one, where unity or oneness here means overcoming separation or the conditions of division. The real is given in and as reconciliation, according to Bonhoeffer. Indeed, his claim is that when one looks at Jesus Christ, one is gazing upon reconciliation in a body, made real, made present, as a real presence in all of its concreteness. Or to put it in his own words, this is a quote, only because there is one place where God and the reality of the world are reconciled with each other, at which God and humanity have become one. Is it possible there, at that place, and there alone, to fix one's eyes on God and the world together at the same time? So God and the world are reconciled. Division is flattened out in the coming together of God and the world in Jesus Christ. He's going to turn around with this theological idea and give it like he's going to pull an ethics out of it. Okay, to continue to quote, it lies in Jesus Christ, the reconciler of the world to God. Whoever looks at Jesus Christ sees, in fact, God and the world in one. From then on, they can no longer see God without the world or the world without God. End quote. What we see here is Bonhoeffer giving a theological account of fascism. His claim is that fascism indexes a falling away from what is real about the world. More still, this falling away, this apostasy, is also a potentially nihilistic falling out of history itself by virtue of being disconnected from what he calls the divine miracle that happens in Jesus Christ. Given this, addressing not only the crisis that is Hitler and the fascism that had incited world war, but also in projecting an afterlife or a life after the war that is not rooted in that fascism anymore or separation, Bonhoeffer insists on a return to a Christological or creedal basis for the human. He's returning to Christian humanism, right? Creedal basis for the human, where again, the human in all of its concreteness is as such a phenomenon of reconciliation, the expression of a certain kind and practice of togetherness or we-ness. The problem with what Bonhoeffer has given us, I maintain, is that notwithstanding his good intentions in setting out the theological terms, a key one being reconciliation, another one being Israel, it being Israel friendly, for a post-fascist future for the West, he in fact re-articulates the terms of a theological as racial colonial terror. Here I'm echoing Calvin Warren's notion of an ontological terror, through which the West arises as a global structure of domination. This is the terror of whiteness as political theology, and political theology precisely as a project of whiteness and of white supremacy. Okay, I'm gonna skip a little bit more. All right, go to this, coming to the end of this section. What I would like to do over the next few lines here, next little while, is unfold why Bonhoeffer's, and perhaps writ large, why theology's commitment to the project of man, capital M, is but the practice of what a former student of mine has called the afterlife of the master, and what I'm here calling the afterlife of whiteness, or of white supremacy, as the practice of political theology in the ongoing discourse of an ethics of the human that Denise Ferreira da Silva has called at the basis, seen as the basis of the global idea of race. All right. I'm going to summarize what I do here and then get to the very end, because I want to just show, I got to make two moves very, very explicit, because they're at the heart of what I want to argue. What Bonhoeffer basically does next is he has a recurring frame. Almost you can read the text as structured almost like a sermon. He got this recurring frame that he keeps coming back to. And the refrain is Ecce Homo, behold the man. And this is how he unfolds an understanding of Jesus Christ in which difference is reconciled in his human flesh. And he unpacks this in several pages. In fact, the bulk of the chapter, Ethics as Formation, is the story of Jesus as the site where difference is not antagonistic, but it's kind of like pulled together, reconciled in his body. When we get to the end of that section, Bonhoeffer then turns and brings out the ethical political stakes of what he has now said. Okay, so rather than me going into and showing, basically how this refrain works, that will be the next several pages here, I'm going to like kind of skip forward and get to the very end where he pulls forward the ethics that's at work here. And then I'll make a few more claims and then I'm going to stop. All righty. All righty. I've spent quite a bit of time, I skipped over it. I've spent quite a bit of time here trying to give a sense at the level of theological analysis of Bonhoeffer's anthropology, his vision of man, capital M, or of the human, as rooted in Christology. That is, I've given a lot of time to his vision of the person and work of Jesus Christ. The phrase Ecce Homo is Bonhoeffer's rhetorical device to throw us, to draw us in. And then once inside the rhetorical edifice of the human, what one discovers is that the idea of formation, ethics as formation, which is really both a rhetoric of discipleship as obedience to the form of the properly human one, Jesus Christ, is in overdrive. It's doing all kinds of massive work for him. I do not have the space here to develop the full depths of the argument, but what starts to come into view in the chapter called Ethics, in the chapter after Ethics as Formation, which is called Heritage and Decay, is the form of reconciliation, the formation of reconciliation, or the vision of reconciliation has everything to do with the gathering of human beings in and as Christ's body, and that this cannot be abstracted from the Jewish concreteness of Jesus's body. The story of the Jews is pulled out in the next chapter, though it's like covertly working in everything that he's been saying about the human. What Bonhoeffer is presenting us with is an ethics of the human as the post-fascist overcoming of Christian supersessionism, as it was this Christian supersessionism over and against the Jews that led to Nazi violence. All of this is well and good. Okay, the ethics, what he's striving for here is, I'm with you. And at the same time, and on another level, the way this overcoming works is profoundly problematic, in as much as it is an overcoming that is not overcoming by way of, it is an overcoming that is also not an overcoming because it reproduces the logic of whiteness. So let me wrap it up by trying to explain how, if not why, this is the case. To do this, I'll need to ask your patience for just a few more minutes in order to surface a final move that Bonhoeffer makes at the very end of the chapter, Ethics as Formation. Now, at the end of that chapter, Bonhoeffer introduces the question of history itself as central to a Christian ethic that proceeds from the reconciliation of the world with God in the human being Jesus Christ, in God's acceptance of real human beings. Actually, that last part is a quote, which of course in his context means Jews too as human beings. But then he goes on to say that, and here's a quote, the question of how Christ takes form among us today, and here, in other words, how we are conformed to Christ's form, contains additional difficult questions. I'm still continuing a quote from Bonhoeffer. These difficult questions are, what do among us? What does today? What does here and now mean? We can't just move to the abstract or the general level. We have to ask, Bonhoeffer insists, for which times and places can an answer be given at all? Working to thread the needle between the particular and the universal, Bonhoeffer says, quoting him, One cannot doubt for an instant that any time and place that we select must be understood as part of the whole of human life. The human being in every part of history is simply the human being whom Christ took on. So everything that is about to be said, I'm still quoting Bonhoeffer, everything that is about to be said about a particular time and place will always point beyond it to the whole of humankind. Still, we must now answer the question: what times and places are we thinking of when we speak about being formed in the form of Christ? End quote. What Bonhoeffer then unfolds in the remaining 4 paragraphs, making up the last page and a half of the chapter, Ethics as Formation, is both frightening and breathtaking. Indeed, and frankly, it's difficult to read. Because Jesus Christ is the enactment of a reconciliatory form of the human in history, Bonhoeffer works to think precisely that reconciliation in history. The upshot turns out to be quite Hegelian, and maybe somewhat Carl Schmittian. He says, and this is a quote, "What is at stake are the times and places that pose concrete questions to us, sets us tasks, and lays responsibilities on us. Among us, today, and here, these terms point to the domain, Bereich, of our decisions and encounters," end quote. Then Bonhoeffer goes on to elaborate the scope of that domain and the nature of that hour. To quote him, "We are placed by our history into a particular context of experience, responsibility, and decision, from which we cannot withdraw without ending up in abstraction. Whether or not we know about it in detail, we actually live in this context. Furthermore, this context is marked in a very particular way, since even in our own times, the form of Christ has been consciously affirmed and acknowledged as its foundations." He continues, "So we as historical people, the people of the West as historical people," this is a Hegelian statement that's getting ready to come at us. "Therefore," he continues, "stand already in the midst of history, taking form in a segment of human history that Christ has chosen." With that statement in place, Bonhoeffer then drops the boom on us, quoting him, "In this sense, we understand the domain for which we wish to speak and must speak to be the West, die Abendland, the peoples of Europe and America who until this time have been unified by the form of Christ, period. A more narrowly drawn frame, narrower than the West, for instance, limited to Germany," he says. What's happening in German National Socialism has narrowed the frame to the nationalistic, "would nullify the fact that the form of Christ is the unity of the Western peoples, and that therefore none of these peoples can exist by itself or even be thought to so exist by themselves. A wider frame, on the other hand, something that's bigger than the Western world, would allow us to overlook the mysterious fact of the distinctive character of the Western world," end quote. All right, I have a few more pages, but what basically becomes, as he finishes off, the last little quote from the chapter, he finishes it off, and then he moves from here to saying that God chooses the West specifically, not at the limited frame of the nation state, nor at the large frame that will include everybody on the earth, but the specificity of the West, because through the vehicle of the West, God will reach the entire planet. So the West has a benevolent missionary function towards the rest of the world. And then the last statement on the page, basically, of Ethics as Formation is that this justifies a certain kind of colonialist posture. He's explicit about this. From there, he goes into the next chapter, Heritage and Decay. And I'll just give you the bottom line because I'm out of time. The bottom line of that chapter is that he narrates the specific unfolding of Western history to justify his claims about the specificity of the West. It turns on the historicity of Jesus. He then links that historicity to the Jews, which then becomes an argument against German National Socialisms that will be exclusionary against the Jewish people, because for Bonhoeffer, the Jewish people are theologically linked at the level of Jesus's Jewish flesh to the project of the West, which also means that Jesus is the kind of sacred imagination of the human that animates the West. Now, there are all kinds of implications from this. One key implication is from the title that I've given this talk, namely, that it's in this move that we get a different kind of supersessionism. Rather than an exclusionary supersessionism, they're out from us, which can lead to Nazism, we have an inclusionary supersessionistic story. That is, the Jews are engulfed into the story of the West and therefore engulfed into the whiteness of the West. And from that vantage point, I then read beyond Bonhoeffer and argue that in effect, his theological vision became the post-World War II world with the UN and its charter, its imagination of human rights, and its official stance against anti-Semitism, because the Semitic Jew is now connected to the West. If that vision, in fact, took hold, we now have a vantage point, a religious vantage point by which to understand nation state of Israel's orientation and colonial, settler colonialist posture against the Palestinians, because colonialism necessarily produces an inferior outside in order to ground and buttress itself. And it turns out through the incorporative mechanism of being incorporated into Western international humanism, the humanism of the West, the nation state of Israel as the state of the Jewish people, thereby reproduces the logic of Christianity at a global political level. In short, nation state of Israel, if I can be a bit provocative, is better understood and best understood as a Christian nation state in continuity with Western statist internationalism. And therefore, I'm calling for, in the kind of work that I'm doing, and invite a conversation with those who are involved in Judaic studies for what it might mean to think Jewish existence as uncoupled from the project of the human. And therefore, as moving in a direction that a number of Black critical theorists are thinking about, modes of life that exceed and are beyond the project of the Western genre of the human, if I can return to the formulation that Sylvia Wynter gives us. Okay, I'll stop. You've been patient. I went over by at least 10 to 15 minutes. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Professor Carter. Here's our predicament. That was such a rich, challenging, provocative talk that is calling on people like me in Jewish studies to be engaged in a conversation. You threw in some very, very, very fraught and interesting and provocative claims at the end, and we have like 2 minutes to have that conversation. So what I think we're going to need to do is issue a kind of mutual invitation here to have this conversation in a different occasion. Mm-hmm. We've got scores and scores of questions. Some of those questions are about, I think, if you're Jewish like myself, I've been hearing what you're saying in light of the very complicated relationship between Jewishness and whiteness. Mm-hmm. There's, a significant number of Jews who do not identify as white. Mm-hmm. Even Jews who identify as white have a complicated relationship to whiteness. So I'm hearing it through that prism, and I think that's adding a layer of complexity to what you're saying, which is, to focus on Christian discourse about Jews, and Jewish voices have not yet entered the conversation. Right. So we've got a lot of people asking questions about that, and I think we've got to figure out, you and I, how to have another conversation about this. And I think people in the meantime, if you don't mind, they can email you at IU in the Religious Studies Department and ask your questions, ask their questions of you directly.
That'd be quite fine. I'm so sorry about that. I was just trying to figure out where I could cut. So I beg the forgiveness of the audience. But I did want to put something of a kind of sharp edge on some of the questions, because I think our moment is ripe and in urgent need of conversations across, shall we say, what we might call identitarian, if not disciplinary lines on these matters. So I did want to kind of like up the stakes a little bit, particularly at the end.
Absolutely, and I hear you very much, and I think that it's a challenge here is you're asking us to supersede supersessionism. Yeah, and that's like an inherently paradoxical thing. So we're going to just have to, continue this conversation in a different context. Mm-hmm. I want to thank everybody in the audience. We're going to have to go now, but I want to thank everybody in the audience for being here. We will have an opportunity to think more about whiteness next week with a talk on religion and white supremacy in the US. And I think that's going to be informed by what we've learned from you today, Professor Carter. So thank you all very much. And thank you so much, Professor Carter. And I'll see you in a few minutes in our class.
Okay, great.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.